Hi, I'm Paul Baxendale, and welcome to blog post number 4. This week sees us back to bodybuilding in the early 90s and the start of my top level competing with the EFBB, the British arm of the IFBB, where each year they would give out 2 pro cards, one for the overall men and one for the overall women's classes. Back then, you really only had one chance a year to claim a pro card. And it wasn't good enough to win your class at the Nationals, but you had to win the overall, a huge task. It meant that many great bodybuilders who could have become very decent pros never got the chance as the depth of competition was immense. But it also meant that the quality of pros coming out of the UK was phenomenal. Everyone was world class and ready for any pro show immediately on winning that coveted card. I will also share some very personal experiences of my time then. Golden days for me, personally, and also for the sport. And hopefully along the way, I will share some lessons that I learned that may help you along your journey, whether in bodybuilding or just through life itself. So here we are, blog number 4. Bodybuilding in the UK in the early to mid 90s, a golden era? I could have written this blog about bodybuilding worldwide in the 90s, as it is often seen as the golden period, or one of the golden periods of the sport, seen by many as a time before the drugs went out of control, before the huge bellies began to appear, before aesthetics were destroyed, and weird substances or lumps began to appear on shoulders, arms and calves to artificially change the genetic shape of the athletes. But that blog would be a major undertaking, and although I promise I will cover this issue in the future, I wanted to continue a little further chronologically on my own journey as I saw and as I experienced it before tackling the bigger issues. And I also wanted to begin to relate my journey to the philosophical, mythological and literary knowledge that now as I look back seemed to go hand in hand with what I was learning back then. The reason for doing so is simple. If you know my background and the experiences I have personally witnessed and partaken in, then it may add some credibility to my input into the bigger topics, such as when I talk about purpose or relationships, ethics and morals, that I do so not as someone who knows more than anyone else, but as someone with the experience and the knowledge of having been there and done that, made those mistakes. Well, not all of them, thankfully, but some of them for sure, rather than some armchair expert who sits behind a computer or some dry academic professor that lives in an ivory tower protected from the real world, completely within a world of books and dishing out what is often ill-judged and biased opinions from someone who knows very little about the subject they are actually spouting off about. I do have the experience and the knowledge, and yet I still don't feel as though it is appropriate for me to make judgments on certain things within this sport, let alone life. However, as I get older, I see too many young people making huge mistakes that could seriously jeopardize their health, their happiness, and damaging their virtue, honor, and integrity, the key attributes that ultimately will be what we are remembered for. Words from a wiser man than I, the Roman philosopher Seneca. The greatest portion of peace of mind is doing nothing wrong. Those who lack self-control live disorientated and disturbed lives. Now we will cover the consequences of living an undisciplined and uncontrolled lifestyle in future blogs. But perhaps you may have already experienced uncomfortable feelings when you yourself did something you knew was purely for instant gratification, for the thrill of the moment, and not in the interests of your greater purpose, and not the right thing to have been done. Those moments, no matter how small they may seem at the time, can ruin lives. Relationships, they can destroy, they can cause pain, heartache and misery. Heaven knows, life can throw pain and suffering at us through pure luck and chance and randomness without us creating more of them for ourselves. I found myself getting more and more uncomfortable with not helping more than just the people I see around me and know personally. I had a sense that I needed to reach out to a larger audience, if they would listen, and to share what I've learned truly matters. 22-inch guns. Well, as huge guns, and then I'm only joking when I say that, because life is serious and it's a gift. We only get one chance with this thing called life, and it can be fleeting and it can be taken from us at any moment. So if I can help one person make a better choice in anything they do, then I'll do whatever it takes to help them, which is the reason behind all these stories you hear. Look at history's greatest heroes and heroines. Look at the movies' greatest ever stars. They all have something in common. They reflect virtues in characters that we deem to be noble, worthy and great. Whether it is Achilles, Hercules, Boudica, Cleopatra, or whether it's Charlton Heston, Clint Eastwood, Audrey Hepburn, Hemingway or Woolf. And yes, I am showing my age here. Okay, so let's say Usain Bolt or Simone Biles. They're not just great athletes, but they appear to be great human beings also. Are they also in true life great human beings? Well, we all have our weaknesses, and all of these characters will have theirs. But their efforts to consistently, day to day, attempt to live their lives to the highest possible standards makes us take notice of them. Yes, their great moments in life are what draws the world to them. But those great moments never would have come if it wasn't for dedication, persistence, overcoming adversity, consistently reaching higher and higher until they were the top. Now, we individually may never be world famous for anything, but if you live your life every day with the highest of standards, being virtuous always, honourable, honest, tell the truth, don't lie to people, keep your word and support those around you in need, then you will, my friends, become great to a good many people, whether you know it or not. Your name will be associated with all the characteristics of a hero or a heroine, and then look around and see what impact you have made, for it will be a world-changing one. Of good people, Seneca said this: good people will do what they find honourable to do, even if it requires hard work. They'll do it, even if it causes them injury. They'll do it, even if it will bring danger. Again, they won't do what they find base, even if it brings wealth, pleasure or power. Nothing will deter them from what is honourable, and nothing will lure them into what is base. This is why I read philosophy for words like those. Back to the bodybuilding and the 90s. I must admit, when it comes to reliving and commenting on the bodybuilders of that period that I competed against and knew, I do honestly stop and first ask myself the question, am I seeing this period through rose-tinted spectacles? Or have I thought the experiences through objectively enough to give an honest, objective view of the time? I like to think I have done the latter, but if there is a little part of me that is also reminiscing with fondness for that period, that is a little biased, then I'll take the criticism and to heck with it. They were great times. Let me tell you why. The UK has always produced some of the world's greatest bodybuilders. Maybe it is our history of hard manual work, the mines, the mills, the canals, the railways, farming with its annual games of strength, and particularly here in Scotland, where the history of a strength contest has now been promoted as though it was part of an ancient clan gathering, the Highland Games. But the history of what most people know as the Highland Games is a relatively recent Victorian invention, as are so many Scottish traditions. And even if semblances of tests of strength may have existed in the past, and they certainly did, they would have looked nothing like the ones you see today. Anyway, men and women of unnatural strength have always been admired within communities within Britain. And as the Industrial Revolution turned people away from hard manual rural tasks, and into cities and office jobs, many people, men particularly, took to lifting weights for pleasure and a way of expressing their masculinity, and also developing a respect for themselves that they could both work hard at whatever job they had to do to pay the bills, and then to physically grind away at the weights week in, week out, to build a physique that meant they never had to tell anyone who or what they were about. Others knew. They knew that you worked hard, that you were focused and disciplined, that you probably had the strength to help in emergencies or hold your own if there was trouble, but that you were also secure enough to never have to use that strength or power unless it was absolutely necessary. From the 1940s and 50s and 60s, bodybuilding in Britain always had a good following, a strong subculture. Although some viewed it as a little odd, but it's always been there through the decades following America in its popularity, despite not being blessed with the same sunny summers and warm beaches. In the 1980s, more gyms began to open, and many were great clubs with good equipment, and there was a growing competitive scene that began to see some amazing physiques coming through. However, it was in the 1990s that some truly phenomenal athletes would be seen at nearly every show you attended. Genetic freaks that looked both big and cut. In fact, more like huge and shredded. Bodybuilding exploded in the UK. More shows were put on, there were more promoters, better shows, better quality of athletes, and the pros that surfaced were world class. Some switching over from winning the NABBA Universe to compete in the IFBB. For example, the great Charles Claremont, who won 4 out of 5 Grand Prix titles in 1993, beating Flex Wheeler and Kevin Levrone, who had just got 2nd and 3rd at the Olympia just weeks before. There was Ian Harrison, the junior universe at 19 years old, who then became the youngest guy to ever win the British overall in 1989. And of course, Eddie Elwood, a 5 times Mr. Universe winner. And there were new guys who came up through the ranks of the IFBB, but sadly the guys transferring from other federations didn't always find it an easy or welcoming process from the judges, and often, in my opinion, got placings well below what they truly deserved. I had good friends that had competed with NABBA and once in the IFBB, despite looking like top 5 material, placed nowhere. A similar thing happened to some American pros who switched to the WBF in the US and then returned to the IFBB stage. I suppose the authorities at the time thought they had to earn their placings again. But that won't surprise anybody who has a good knowledge of the sport. I remember in my own town, there were several competitive bodybuilders. From what I hear today, we'd be lucky to find 2 or 3. This was a situation that was common throughout all the towns all over the UK. London had Muscleworks Gym, who always produced great bodybuilders, and then up north, in what could be called the powerhouse of bodybuilding, from Manchester and Better Bodies Gym, upwards and then westwards towards Wales and the land of dragons. So to say there were several bodybuilders competing from my town, many were just starting out, but there were a handful who were already national level, and with that came a level of rivalry and competition that I believe made us improve even more. That's the thing with having a few different bodybuilders in any one town. The inspiration they give out rubs off on everybody else in the sport, making everybody believe that they can do it. If they can do it, then why not me? And it was true. This small select group of athletes did make others think that they could compete, as well as seeing the respect and attention that were given to them. I think others wanted to be held in the same regard and with the same respect. There was Lorne McCullough, Vern Montgomery, Roy Bunce. There was an older guy, I can't remember his name. He competed naturally, winning a few natural national shows. But let's just say he took an extended vacation to Spain each year and came back remarkably different from when he went. So no comment on the natural status there. In truth, it was Lorne McCullough who was the one who was really doing things. He moved down to Bristol, so he left the town, but we continued to be friends, and he was a great support in my early years. He was a great middleweight competitor with the EFBB, and although we rarely trained with each other, we would often talk, and I was inspired by his physique. The only times we did train with each other would be in Bristol at LA Gym, or Church Gym I think it was called. It was in an old church on a hill near the centre of Bristol on the way out to the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Now that was a great gym. And another awesome middleweight trained there, a guy called Jeff Nutt, who may be familiar to some of you. We travelled to Europe together on many occasions, competing in various federations. And I think also when I came back from retirement, he was still competing internationally with us. We were different classes. I was a super heavyweight. He was a great guy, and his conditioning was freaky. Lorne and Vernon were also both friends with Johnny. Johnny Fuller was very much a father figure to all of us young, aspiring bodybuilders in town. But before long, Vernon had stopped competing. I think he was focused on business, but he always kept himself in great shape. And now I believe his son is carrying the torch forward, and he has a great physique himself. And I have a feeling he is also competing, maybe in men's physique or classic bodybuilding, I'm not sure. Hopefully someone out there can tell me. I'd like to say we were like brothers back then. And maybe we were to a certain extent, because there was always an element of ego or envy or gossip going on. I was never one to gossip, but I admit I was a little on the arrogant side. I knew, rightly or wrongly, that I was moving forwards faster than the others, even though I had been training seriously for less time. But maybe it was because I was also more dedicated. I took all of my annual leave every year to travel up to Birmingham 3 times a week to train with Dorian over about an 18-month period. So that meant I had no time for small town egos or gossip. I was focused completely on trying to reach the top solo spot. So we drifted apart. But before then, we did have some great experiences together. I remember Lorne's mother being Jamaican. She was a great cook, and he was too. Chicken, beans and rice Jamaican style was like heaven on earth. And the first time I qualified for the British finals, Lorne, together with my girlfriend, were the only people from my town that came to Wembley to support me. There were others who came to see me, but from further afield, which I guess showed where the true bodybuilding fans were back then. Like my dear old friend, sadly now passed, Graham Black, himself a NABBA world champion from Newbury. I think it was because I didn't have a gym base really in my hometown. Because I was driving 3 times a week to Birmingham and to Temple, I only had 1 session a week at a local gym to train at. So I would sometimes vary which one I trained at. Normally, it was a small gym within a rugby club, which I would later have a gym in myself. And I think it was called Tropicana Gym back then. Or I would train at Swindon Gym and Fitness Centre, owned by a guy who also competed naturally and was a good support in my early years. But even then, I could feel the jealousy or tall poppy syndrome. Well, I could sense people almost wanting me to fail. It's a common phenomenon and not unique to any one place or country. But you simply have to ignore it, which was easy to do when you're focused on being bigger and better rather than bringing other people down. And accept that it's people's own insecurities that's being displayed here. It's really nothing to do with you or your personality. So my first British final, and I came in sliced and diced. At 8 weeks out, it wasn't looking that good, but then Dorian gave me a kick up the arse, told me to up my cardio to twice a day, cut back on my carbs slightly, and within 2 weeks I was back on track. Still a way to go, but I was within striking distance. I do remember that when I was announced on stage at the Britain, I'd put down my gym as Temple Gym in Birmingham, as that was where I had done most of my training. but I was always made to feel welcome in most of the gyms in Swindon. Not all. There was one that pretended to be for bodybuilders and everyone, but didn't want my £310 off-season physique training in there, as it may give the wrong impression to others. What that is, that's where champions trained. Strangely, after asking me not to train there, they would cheekily, shortly after, ask me to hand out trophies at their own attempt at a bodybuilding show, which was more like a beachwear competition in all honesty. But I did the respectful thing, and I thanked the owner for asking me, and then said no. So I'll always thank and admire Lorne for supporting me that day. When no one else in the town could be bothered to come and support me, that's how bad the jealousies can be when you begin to break through. Everyone loves you when you're trying, just as they are, to be a champion. But then when you do become one, it reminds and makes them feel smaller, and then they want to bring you down. I guess it's a reminder to them that they haven't done it, and so they desire to bring you back down to their level again. It was tough, but strangely, I was warmly welcomed by any of the great gyms where the champions trained at, and I was in awe at most of their members. Temple Gym, Better Bodies Gym, Muscle Works, Ian Harrison's gym, Church Gym, etc. The EFBB British in those early days of the 90s was like a pro lineup. Seriously, the names were full of people who would turn pro or could have turned pro. People who could have been top Olympia contenders, but for whatever reason they chose either not to go on due to costs maybe, or commitments to other ventures, or their lives took other turns. Let me list a few of the names that were up on that heavyweight stage during the 90s. True freaks and beautiful physiques, and many coming in sliced and diced. J.D. Dawodu, Ian Wadley, Jamo Nazar, Alex Brooks, Amory Francis, Sean Davis, Mark Rhino Smith, Eddie Abu, Leonard St. Cyr, Paul Delahaye, Darren Spears. That was just the heavies. In the light heavies there was Rob Wall, Cecil Crossdale, Rob Worthington, my buddy and my training partner with Dorian, Kenny Brown. And don't let me forget my old buddy Ernie Taylor. And that was just the men, phenomenal. The women were just as spectacular, with Kimberly Ann Jones, Nicola Thomas, her sister Joanne, who sadly passed recently, which was devastating to many people. I can't imagine what her family went through and is still going through. Lahana Roshi and Drula Blanchette, who would often come up to Temple Gym with Ian Dow of Dow Dynamics to train. No, there's no way I'm looking at this period with rose-tinted spectacles. This was a golden era, and it continued until the end of the 90s with Grant Thomas, Stevie Crichton, John Hodgson, Peter Brown. Either side of the 90s you had Ian Harrison, Dorian Yates, Eddie Elwood, and then later in the 2000s a certain Flex Lewis popping up as a youngster to take the overall in 2007. And one of my personal favourites, Paul George, in 2004, who won the overall as a middleweight. That's how good he was. So the quality was there, but what was it like competing with the guys like this? Was it intimidating? Were they friendly? Was there really a brotherhood of iron back then? Or was it more cutthroat than that? And were there the petty jealousies that I sometimes experienced in the town I came from? Well, it seems that the town I lived in was like being a big fish in a little pond. And maybe that's why there were some petty feelings being expressed. At the national level, where the true talent and the big guns were, it was completely different. It was a true brotherhood. A mutual respect existed for everyone, and it really was a true brotherhood of iron and a sisterhood of iron. When your sparring partner scratches or headbutts you, you don't then make a show of it or protest or view him with suspicion or as plotting against you. You should act this way with all things in life. We should give a pass to many things with our fellow trainees. Marcus Aurelius. Maybe It was the mutual respect that everyone there was conscious of the fact that even in getting to the finals meant that you had proved yourself to some degree. But when I first walked into the Wembley Conference Centre, I instantly felt that respect. I had won my regional show, the Wessex, that year as a heavyweight, and hoped I'd done enough to deserve my place on that stage. It was a strange experience. People looked at me with the sense that I was somebody. Not that I needed any reinforcement of my ego or anything like that. It was more of a case that it was an acceptance that I belonged there, belonged at that level. But would my physique also belong up there on stage with those awesome heavyweights? It was in the foyer that I was introduced into exactly what I was entering, what level I was about to test myself. And that introduction was a man who was walking around laughing with a large group of friends and the most impressive arms that I'd seen since, well, Temple Gym. Amory Francis. His guns were just huge. I was spellbound. I stood watching him and seeing his outgoing personality and how people were just attracted to him. And he had a charisma that just drew you to him. But those guns. He wasn't competing that year though. I'd never seen arms like it off season. They were absolutely phenomenal. And it did make me wonder, had I bitten off more than I could chew? I tried to relax and I tried to put things into perspective. I had won my qualifier easily, straight first. I'd received a standing ovation. And even Kerry Case. Kerry was our guru back then. Not that he charged anyone except in sweat, blood, tears and pain. Kerry had helped Dorian when he had first come on the scene. And Kerry was the foundation supporting British bodybuilding back then. A great, great man Kerry is. Even Kerry had said that I'd looked good and was ready for the British. I dieted even harder and brought down my weight an extra 3 pounds from the qualifier. And my condition was markedly improved. On my road to the show, I had visited both Kerry and Dorian, and both had taken a look at me frequently and always kept me honest. When I thought I was ready, I would visit Kerry, who would say, another 4 pounds, Paul. And then I'd see Dorian, who'd say, another 4 or 5 pounds, Paul. Where the heck from? My backside hurt when I sat on the bike. I had no fat on my backside anymore. Where was this 5 pounds to come from? Well, if I'd been able to see my back then, I would have been able to see. They were absolutely correct. And in coming in right, bringing in a new level of conditioning that I'd never brought in before or seen on myself, I knew that I was on. The interesting thing for others to remember is that at the same time Dorian was telling me I had another 5 pounds to lose, everyone in the local gym was saying to me, Paul, you're shredded, peeled, sliced to the bone, you're ready, you're bang on, which just goes to show that the people in the gym are not the ones to ask advice from. Maybe they were telling me what they thought I wanted to hear, but more realistically, they just didn't know what real condition was. Seeing me in the shape I was in, they thought that was contest ready, but it wasn't Dorian contest ready, and I knew which one I wanted to achieve. Have faith in yourself and have a plan. Life without a design is erratic. As soon as one is in place, principles become necessary, said Aurelius. For as in bodybuilding, when you set a plan, you immediately have to set in place principles to enable you to complete it. You set a goal to build a better physique, then you need to stick to eating better, training harder, sleeping and resting properly. Try and be a champion, not wasting your life away with parties, drinking, useless endeavors, moments of worthless pleasure. Instead, go for years of valuable success, virtue and integrity. Principles are everything. Create them, hold them dear, and never let them slip away from you for anything. Just as in life, you do the same. You set a plan to build a business, build a charity, find a wife or a husband who you can share all of life's most beautiful moments with. Whatever it is you cherish, set a plan, then set your principles that will allow you to achieve it. I had to have faith in myself, And although I knew I wasn't going to match the other guys for muscle size this year or do any damage to the top placings, I did know I was going to be able to match anyone on condition. And if anyone was coming in slightly off, then if I stood next to them, it was going to show. I made my way to the changing room door and I walked through. It was like walking into another world, a whole new world, one that would blow me away, but at the same time inspire me for years. I walked through the doors, and honestly, when I looked inside at the physiques inside, my first reaction was to turn right round and go right back home. That's the truth for you. And that's worth saying. I won't lie to you ever. Whatever you hear from these blogs will be the truth. Now, the truth is critical, because without it, these stories are just that, stories. But if they are true as well, then they transform into possible learning lessons and thoughts that may help you and maybe guide you in your next steps or decisions you take in life. And turning around and going home was exactly what I was feeling, and yet I didn't turn around. I walked in and I saw most of the guys sat around a large table smoking a joint and passing it around. Before I knew it, I was offered it with a "Hi, nice to meet you. I heard you look great at the qualifier. Wow." I smiled and I started chatting with everyone, and I was soon at home and feeling as if I belonged, even with a joint in my hand. Even though I looked around me and thought everyone looked as though they were off season, they were so huge, I thought maybe everybody else was feeling the same, although I doubt it. The only one that was off season was Amory Francis, as I'm sure he didn't compete that year, but my memory isn't great, so excuse me if I get a detail or two wrong here or there. Anyway, before too long, we were given an hour's notice before we were going on stage for our comparisons. And so we all began our own rituals for preparing for the stage. My own was very simple. I had no fancy foods to eat, no scientific last-minute protocols to implement to create a big difference in my physique. What was there that lunchtime, what was going on stage later? I'll bite a little drier and a little fuller. I was already tanned up because back then we used Pro-Tan. So all that was left to do was to pump up, oil up, take a little fluid to get the dryness out of my mouth, and to take a little bit of chocolate, and if I felt any potential cramping, to eat a few salted crisps. I didn't feel as though I was going to cramp, so I just had one square of dark chocolate, a mouthful of water, a mouthful of calm drink, and walked out onto the stage. The other guys were massive. I knew I wasn't, but I knew I was sliced. Guys were complimenting me on my condition even as we walked out on stage. Yes, I knew. They knew I wasn't going to be a threat for the top placings. But for my first appearance, I wanted to just show that I belonged there on that stage and that I could show a level of conditioning that was beyond shredded. I wanted people to gasp when I hit a pose, to see the fibers splintering and every muscle clearly separated and striated. I had done my job. Looking back, my overriding feelings of that day was of brotherhood, of gratitude, of respect, of awe, and finally one of belonging. Those great group of guys sat around that table, they could have laughed at me. And they could have made a joke about, "Hey, buddy, the novices are down the hall." They could have completely ignored me, not knowing me from Adam. But instead they smiled with warmth. They spoke with respect, as though to another brother. They had no idea what I was hiding underneath my tracksuit, and had no idea of what I looked like. But maybe they knew, like Kerry Kayes always used to say, never worry about the big, huge guy walking around smiling and acting like he's the boss. Worry about the guy with a face like a skeleton, who looks like he's about to die or pass out, who's lying down in the corner with his feet in the air and a tracksuit covering himself from head to toe. Kerry knew. Amory Francis, Ian Wadley, Jamu Nazar, Ian Wadley, Alex Brooks, Eddie Abu, Ricky Welling, Alex Brooks, Mark Rhino Smith, Leonard Sincere, I thank you, gentlemen. Without you, I may well have turned around at the doorway and never tried again. Although I think Dorian would still have inspired me to go for it again. But you were my brothers. And many of them still are. I still, to this day, message and talk with some of these guys on the internet, whether it's social media or email. I'm always amazed that they remember me, but they're always surprised when I tell them how much they inspired me and still do to this day. All the greats of that era, Amory, JD, Mark, Jamo, especially, are always writing little comments on posts, or they did until I came off of social media over 2 years ago. But I've recently gone back on Instagram to share these stories and the photos of the great bodybuilders of all time. And I always do the same, whether it's a funny story, a humorous anecdote, or simply a word of respect for all that they still do for our sport. And that these are the people we should always remember. These are the guys who paved the way for Britain to be a powerhouse in the world of bodybuilding. And let's not forget the ladies too. Kimberly Ann Jones, what a woman. Paula Birkinshaw, again, what a lady. Hardcore, old school, no bull. Bodybuilders through and through, with a love for the sport that keeps them inspiring the new generation and keeps them real and keeps them grounded. Paula was the hardest trainer in the UK, along with Dorian and Billy Payne. And she was Billy's training partner for years. So those two are level pegging in my book, both legends and both icons. I remember she told me about the time she and Billy were banned from a gym in Leeds for making too much noise while they trained. And that was back in the 80s. Freaking animals. What made the day extra special for me was that Dorian was a guest poser at the show, straight from his third Mr. Olympia victory in Georgia in the US. Yes, it was the year he had torn his biceps just weeks before the finals. I know, because I remember coming down the stairs of Temple Gym the day after he had torn it, and I knew he was due to train, yet there he was sat on the bench. Something was wrong, very wrong. He showed me his arm, which by then had gone black and blue from his wrist to his armpit. It looked horrific, and he was despondent for sure. But he said he would see how it healed, and whether or not his physio, Stuart Cosgrove, would advise for it to be reattached or not, or whether he would see how it looked after the bruising had gone down, whether he would still keep going, which we all know now he did, and won the Olympia. Through pure grit and the effort of the last few years training meant that he lost nothing except for the damaged shape of the bicep itself. And that perhaps is a blog post for another time. If you want to get a flavour of the characters and the values and the ethics we held in those days, then I recommend you go onto social media and follow Paula and Billy and all of the names I've given today. Take a look at their posts. These men and women are the real deal. They've been there, they've done it, and they are a wealth of knowledge, which is available to anyone on social media pages. No, they're not as flashy and full of photos of themselves, and not maybe as trendy as many of today's top social media stars, but their comments and messages are priceless, worth their weight in gold. So, without making this post too long, what do I think made the 90s such a golden period in British bodybuilding? And why were the physiques, in my opinion, filled with such class in depth? Well, I think it was the way we trained, the way we dieted, and the way we kept things as uncomplicated as possible. Yes, bodybuilders have always pushed the edge of the limits when it comes to supplementation, nutrition, training, and other protocols. But all those things were kind of secondary. What was most important to us was the training that we put into practice for a whole year. Training came first. It was like a badge of honor. Seriously. If anyone trained like I see some pros train today, with all the machines and pumping style movements, with a phone in one hand, they would have been laughed out or kicked out of the gym with zero respect from any true iron warrior. Training hard was what separated the men and the women from the boys and the girls. Being the hardest trainer was the title everyone wanted. Throwing up in a bucket or throwing up outside was not something that was frowned upon. It was maybe laughed at, but it was respected. Heavy training for single reps didn't impress anyone, unless you were a powerlifter, of course. Heavy weights for sets of 8 to 12 reps, that was what impressed people. That's the difference. And everyone had legs. Seriously, legs were the sign that you were a serious bodybuilder and not just someone who trained and competed for fun. Those beasts had monster legs. Look at my Instagram post this week and I'll post up some photos of Ian Harrison's quads, with the rest of him of course, and all the other great quad beasts of this era. If you didn't have legs, you weren't taken seriously. And to get huge legs, you had to train hard, brutally hard. I really don't see people train like we used to back then. But then maybe I'm not going to the right gyms. I'm sure there are many people out there who do train just as hard. But let it be a reminder that it all starts and ends in the training. The training, the diet and the rest are the basics that made the greats of this era. Well, farmer grade gear was a plus too, I suppose. But that's again a story from another blog post. People won't believe how little most of us guys took back then. When I tell people, normally they think I'm lying to them, but it's true. Wait for the blog post and find out for yourself. Nutrition and dieting was simple. It never has been and never should be rocket science. You burn more than you eat, then you'll lose weight. If you eat more than you burn, then you'll gain weight. It's pretty simple stuff. Yes, we had more insights into it than that, and many had a deep knowledge when it came to nutrition. But I just wanted to try and emphasize that there was very little bullshit around then. Phrases like peak week, reverse dieting, and the like would have seen you laughed out of your gym, especially if it was a top gym with top level physiques in it. Seriously, it makes me laugh or cry when I hear people talking about peak week as though it will make or break those last 12 weeks of prep. If you're really ready, and the word really is the key to it all here, then there isn't much you can do to mess it up. If you've dieted down to proper, shredded, grainy, sick, freaky levels of conditioning, then there isn't much of a need to do anything at all. All Dorian would ever do for his Olympia week was to reduce his carbs by half, up his protein and fats at the start of the week, then double the normal intake of carbs on the first 2 days after the depletion phase, and then back to his normal diet on the last day. Simple, isn't it? And when I hear about bikini girls or figure girls or physique guys or athletes holding 50 or 60 kilograms of body weight talking about peak week and the complicated processes their coaches and gurus are having them do to be at their best, please, these athletes are not holding enough muscle to make the slightest bit of difference what carbing up process or sodium or water depletion you use. What do they have to carb up? There isn't enough muscle. Please get a grip of yourself and come back to reality and stop pretending that you're a mass, monstrous, elite bodybuilder with a body that's so huge and primed to perfection that a few extra carbs will make any difference whatsoever. It's all bullshit, pardon my expression. Is it possible to be free from error? Not by any means. But it is possible to be a person always stretching to avoid error. Epititis. So that's why the bodybuilders were so good. They did their work in the gym, proper work, gut-wrenching work, and dieted hard enough so they were ready at least 1 week out, so that they could literally cruise into the show looking world class. That's all for today, friends. Check back in next week for another story of things funny, crazy, real and old school in next week's blog. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I look forward to the next. Thank you for dropping by. I've gone on about the 90s a lot today, and I believe for good reason too. It was a great era, but any era can be great. Today's era can be great. Look at the guys in the classic bodybuilding class. To me, they look great. And some of the top pro bodybuilders also look good. But there is something in the lack of dryness, the lack of granite hardness that's missing from the sport today. And it's just my opinion, but I love that look. I love it because there's no way of getting it without hard work and brutal dieting. No matter. Whatever era you prefer is your opinion, and rightly so. Stick to it. But perhaps take some lessons away from today's ramblings about the need for a hard work ethic, the values of truthfulness, of virtue, and of integrity. These are the values that will separate you from everyone else. It will lead you to become the leader and put yourself in a position where you can influence others' lives for the better. I hope in some small way I've done that today for somebody. Thank you for listening to this old man rambling about his bodybuilding and his philosophy. I love my days in the sport and don't regret anything. Well, maybe one or two things. We're all human. But you know, if you rise every day with the mindset that you will do everything possible in your power to live this day to your highest possible standards, then no one can ever ask for more from you. I'll leave you with the words from Aurelius. Whatever anyone does or says, for my part, I'm bound to the good. In the same way an emerald or gold or purple might always proclaim, whatever anyone does or says, I must be what I am and show my true colours. Thanks very much for listening. It's been a pleasure. I'll see you next week. Goodbye.